Welcome to each one of you. Today we are going to talk about religious liberty and in the context of Religious Liberty Sabbath. But why celebrate religious liberty? First of all, we have to remember that today, and in particular, yes, in America, when people hear the word religious liberty, they connect it with cases like Kim Davis, the county clerk who refused to sign papers for same-sex marriages, or sometimes people reduce it to the idea of not paying insurance that could contribute to contraceptive measures and so forth. But there is more to religious liberty than meets the eye. And we would like to look more closely. What is it when we are really talking about religious liberty? And also, why do we celebrate religious liberty? Maybe from the outset, I will have to specify this. When we celebrate religious liberty, it is not just for religious liberty's sake, especially from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective. When we talk about religious liberty, it is a sign of the ultimate freedom. And actually, when we talk about ultimate freedom, only God is ultimately free. That is, only God is totally autonomous. He doesn't depend on anything. So that is really total freedom. But this God, who is totally free, he doesn't need anything, has decided out of pure love to actually create people in his image. And this he did out of love. Why is that so? Because it is impossible to have a covenant, a love covenant relationship without freedom. So God, in being love, created freedom so that human beings, every one of you, may enter in a covenant relationship with him. So that's really the foundation of why we talk about religious freedom, because a God who is free is actually involved in making people who are free so that ultimately people can enter into a covenant relationship with him. Now, there is one step further, though, as far as when we talk about religious freedom. Why do we celebrate something that we call religious freedom? In fact, religious freedom is more than just, as I mentioned earlier, the right not to do or the right to do things. Of course, at a basic level, it is the freedom to profess, to practice, and to propagate one's faith. Now, these are basic concepts, but it is worth reminding each one of us that the right to worship, the right to profess, the right to practice, and the right to propagate one's faith is not a favor any government is giving, but rather it is a right. Actually, I could even say a God-given right. As I mentioned earlier, in creating human beings, God has created us free to choose. And by the way, this is extremely important. When we talk about free to choose, that presupposes other freedoms. For example, the freedom to think, freedom of conscience. And that leads to this prerogative for every human being to have the right to choose. To choose what to believe, of course, and to choose what not to believe. In a sense, then, religious freedom is something that is intimately connected to what it means to be a human being. That is at a personal, at a more existential level for everyone to understand that every person has the right to think, the right to make choices, and of course, according to the dictates of one's conscience. But let's now look at in society when people talk about religious freedom. Beyond that existential, personal freedom connected, of course, to the most intimate freedom, as I mentioned earlier, the freedom of conscience, what is it that what are we really talking about when we talk about religious freedom? Now, it is, first of all, a fundamental right. Meaning, when you look at the fundamental freedoms, religious freedom is one of them. So there are basically several fundamental freedoms. And the thesis here, or the idea, the basic idea, is that religious freedom is an integrative part, an intrinsic part of those fundamental freedoms. This is why it is so important. Actually, in some countries, such as the United States, religious freedom is considered to be a primordial freedom. In other words, one of the first freedom that this nation has considered as necessary for the building up of peace and harmony in society. So then, if religious freedom is a primordial freedom, that of course tells us about its importance, its primacy, but it goes beyond that, because religious freedom is actually connected to all the other freedoms. It is central to other freedoms, and it is also called a compound freedom in that it contains all the others. Now, this is just logical, because if I have a freedom of religion or belief, which means, by the way, the freedom to believe or the freedom not to believe, that presupposes freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and of course, freedom of assembly with others. So this means that freedom of religion is then a compound freedom. So, as a matter of fact, in the Seventh-day Adventist working policy, there is this statement, that says freedom of religion or religious liberty is a primordial freedom which undergirds all the other freedoms. Again, this shows very early in Seventh-day Adventist consciousness, this freedom was seen as extremely important, because when you touch religious freedom, you actually touch other freedoms at the same time. Now, this takes us one step further. This means that if you take care of religious freedom, if you work for the promotion, for the protection of religious freedom, it means at the same time you are working for other freedoms, since it is central to all of them and it is connected to each one of them in that sense. But now you can see why, beyond just a matter of individual liberty, governments, now this is not a favor that they are granting, no, but governments have this responsibility to protect these freedoms so that everyone may, according to their rights, enjoy this particular freedom. Now, this is the reason why it is very, very significant that almost every constitution has inscribed this idea of religious freedom. The right to profess, the right to practice, the right to propagate one's faith to your children, but it goes even further in a social context. It means also the right to own property devoted to religious matters, devoted to worship, for example. So that means then government in their constitutions recognize that this is a fundamental right, that this right should be secured for every citizen in every country. Yes, that is the ideal, and many countries live according to this fundamental constitutional right. But unfortunately, when you look at the current situation, the status of religious freedom around the world, unfortunately, there are some surprises, because 76% of world population live under some forms of restriction to religious freedom. This restriction, rather, has actually two facets to it. Sometimes it is governmental restrictions, meaning governments who are not living according to their own constitutions. They are not favoring their constitution, so they prevent people from enjoying this right. But sometimes it also comes under the form of popular hostility, meaning in a given country, a majority religion using the power of the state in order to restrict religious freedom of minorities. So again, even though it is a constitutional right, there are breaches in many countries, as I just mentioned. More than three-fourths of the world population is not enjoying this freedom. But this freedom is actually important because it is part of, as I mentioned earlier, a God-given prerogative. It is a gift, another word, from God. How so? Well, God is a God of freedom. And as I mentioned earlier, actually the Apostle Paul summarizes the essence of Christianity as a call to freedom. In the book of Galatians, he very clearly says, it is for liberty that Christ has set us free. But of course, he will add, but do not take that liberty to cover wickedness and so forth. But the fundamental principle of having this freedom given, that Christ came for the purpose of giving people freedom, I think that is core in understanding what Christianity is all about. So a God of freedom, who is totally free, who created a world out of freedom, not out of necessity, out of freedom and out of love, decided to grant every human being created in his image this gift of freedom. Now, this gift of freedom has been lost, according to the Bible, because of sin, because of disconnection to God, and because of blunt disobedience and rebellion. However, God did not leave humanity in that slavery status. Rather, Christ came and actually he lived, he taught, he died, he resurrected in order to bring, according to the Apostle Paul, this fundamental gift, the gift of liberty. Again, Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. But something really important here. Twice he repeats, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free in the 5th chapter of the book of Galatians. But then, if you wonder, what is the nature of freedom? What does it look like? What is the profile of a free person? This is where Galatians 5 is also significant. And as we celebrate freedom, actually, it is a celebration of God. And let me specify. In Galatians, after saying that we are called for freedom, the apostle adds, therefore, walk by the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is God coming to actualize, to enable us to live freely. And this is fundamental. Actually, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17, the Apostle Paul again says there that where the Spirit of Christ is, there is freedom. So freedom is intimately connected to the fact, to the presence actually of the Holy Spirit. But then, when we come back to Galatians chapter 5, what does the Holy Spirit realize in a free person? Very simply, the profile of a free person, a person full of the Holy Spirit, is simply a person who bears the fruit of the Holy Spirit. What is a free person? Well, a free person, again, is a person who bears the fruit of the Spirit. And what are those? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So in other words, a free person, as we celebrate freedom, not just at a constitutional level, not just at a governmental level, not just even as a civil right, as a political right, all those are good. And all those tells us about the importance of freedom. However, at a personal level, especially for Christians, because this is not just about promoting, like a philosophical concept of freedom, even in the context of America, Thomas Jefferson and John Locke, and even before that, Thomas Hobbes and so forth. We could develop all that. But however, more fundamentally, the concept of freedom that we are talking about, that we are celebrating, is actually the freedom connected to the Holy Spirit. Where the Spirit is, there is freedom. And again, what is that? Well, it is a person who is engaged, involved in loving others, having peace, kindness, joy, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control. That is a person who is free. And really, Liberty Sabbath Day, it's not just about talking about freedom in general. It's about the freedom that every person shows to others by loving others, by being kind to others, by being gentle. It's no use to talk about freedom if the fruit of the Spirit is not present. So that really is what we celebrate.